Welcome, folksy folks. Welcome to Fabric of Folklore. I'm your hostess, Vanessa Y. Rogers, and this is the podcast where we unravel the mysteries of folklore. And in this podcast, we're attempting to adjust our perspective to understand the world from its roots. We're uncovering where our holiday traditions came from and why they're important, where the folktale of the troll originated, such as in episode 1, and its significance. We look at our everyday lives to try and better understand our own culture as well as others, such as this fun fact about a toy that you might have lying around in your house, which originated over 2,000 years ago. The yo-yo is actually an ancient toy dating back to 550 BC. There are records of ancient Greece children playing with yo-yos made out of wood, metal, and terracotta. Now, this example might seem trivial because it's about a toy, but it gives us context and connection to other countries and those people across the world. This podcast at its heart is about connection, connecting through understanding with people from different life experiences. So if that sounds like a podcast that you are interested in following, make sure you hit that subscribe button so that you get our notification every Tuesday when our new podcast drops. And today's show is all about blues as well as the African-American experience. And we are so honored to have our guest, Lamont Jack Pearley, is an award-winning independent filmmaker and radio journalist. His discipline is an applied folklorist, ethnographer, African-American traditions music historian, and blues practitioner. He's the founder and editor-in-chief of the African-American Folklorist magazine and hosts a weekly segment on the WKU Public Radio and NPR called the African-American Folklorist. He was inducted in the New York Blues Hall of Fame as a great blues historian and TV radio producer in 2017 and great blues artist in 2018. His work he works with local communities to advocate in documenting their stories and strategizing and implementing long-term goals for cultural sustainability. So welcome so much for coming on our show today.
Thank you for having me.
So can you give us a little bit of a timeline? Because you have a lot going on. What got started first? Did you start the African-American Folklorist or the Dapper Blues podcast? What came first? And just walk us through your journey.
Well, what actually came first was Indie Filmmakers Talk podcast. I worked in news and business news media, and I started a podcast that was giving tools for independent filmmakers. But I've always been into culture, my culture particularly, and tradition, particularly because that was just what was in my house, my family, my mother specifically, who was a teacher, and she always said, we have culture. It just so happens a couple of things happened simultaneously. My father passed away, my grandfather passed away, so I was back in Louisiana, and when we buried my grandfather. When we buried my father on a Pearly burial ground, and my grandfather, who we buried in a military cemetery in Maryland or in Washington, but all of our family from Chicago, Detroit, and Mississippi was there, and two things happened at the same time, which was my folk from down home, Mississippi and Louisiana, was in both places, and there was this spark. The spark made me begin to earnestly look at certain things, and I realized that the great migration that moved our music, my family literally was part of. They were part of the music, they were part of the tradition from foodways on, and they were part of that migration. To fast forward a bit, something happened on Facebook, and I was so upset because what I was thinking was, Black folk are so upset or possibly traumatized by the treatment in this culture, in this country. They've relinquished the roots of our tradition. So I set out to try to reconnect, and that's how Talking About the Blues was born. And from talking about the blues, we get to Jack Dapper blues when I actually get on the radio in New York and New Jersey. From that, we get the nonprofit Jack Dapper Blues Heritage Preservation Foundation, and then the magazine is a part of that organization, which is African-American Folklorist.
Okay, so it's an offshoot of the Jack Dapper Blues Heritage Preservation Foundation?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so but you yourself were raised in New York?
Yeah, first generation New York. I was raised in New York under, you know, you see these, it's so ironic, and I like how you say you want to uncover certain things when it comes to folklore, right? You're raised under certain things that you see but aren't aware of or don't take for granted. And then when you get into this discipline, and whether it's by default or after you understand what you're involved in, it's more intentional. I realized that my family, even though me, my cousins and siblings were raised in New York, we still were how do I put this? We still lived by country values in the big city. So what my grandparents were doing in Louisiana and or Mississippi is how they raised us in Brooklyn. You know.
Right. So how did you get to Kentucky?
Well, so I've been what one would call an independent or community scholar for some time, and I found Shirley Moody Turner, who was the first African American folklorist I met and interviewed, and then I met Simon Bonner, and both of them told me about AFS. Simon Bonner directed me to the people I need to speak to. And I ended up at AFS, and I didn't know these folk even knew they knew of me and my work, and they were welcoming. And I saw that this was a space that I can possibly contribute in connecting community and laypersons to academia. And I just realized there was so many folks of the communities that I frequent with that, and even folks that I was honored to be able to speak to of all ethnicities in this discipline. We didn't know what we were doing with folklore ethnography, you know. And so I decided to go back and get my master's, and Western Kentucky University has the best graduate program for folk studies. So that's what brought my family and I here.
Okay. And how culturally is Kentucky different from New York, where you were raised?
Is extremely different, you know.
Right. Yes. What did you specifically notice?
Wow. So what we call in New York rural, they call the city. You know,
Yeah.
but to be fair, growing up visiting Louisiana a lot, I remember as a kid saying, "Okay, we're going down south to the country." And then when we get there, one of my grandparents, so both of them, or my dad, would be like, "Okay, we're going into the country." And in my mind, I'm like, "But we're in the country." I didn't know there was a country. You know what I mean? So there's levels that you have to understand. Politics and folk interaction agreements, if you will. I need to write that down because
So you talked a little bit about when you came together with your family from all over the country, and it sparked something in you. Can you talk about maybe something that happened? Was there something specifically that happened, or was there what was that light bulb? What caused that spark?
So when we were engaged in the service for my father's transcension, we first went to a church in Nolens because he was born and raised there. Actually, he died there. Well, really Harvey, but that was his favorite place.
Mm.
So we went from that church, then we went to the country, which was Belrose. And we went in this big church, and the church had a big land. It was on a dirt road, and across the street was a shotgun house. So this is the first time that I'm seeing that my family has a burial ground of Pearlies. Then I find out that 95% of the population is Pearlies. I hope I'm not exaggerating, but a large
Wow.
portion of that place is my family.
Uh-huh.
Now I'm sitting in the shotgun house across the street in the repass, and country blues, pre-war country blues and black spiritual is playing. And I'm looking around and I'm just seeing things that is just, spark. So I come back and I have 1,000,010 questions for my mother
Mhm.
and other people in the family.
Uh-huh.
And kind of the same thing happened when my grandfather passed. So I just
Mm.
started uh, looking for people to talk to and interview. And I was finding a lot of non African American blues musicians initially. It took a long time, but then I started finding um, African American blues musicians, or even they may not have been musicians, but they had similar stories, and I just started documenting stories of everybody. Not
Mm.
there's enthusiasts. There's a filmmaker who's a good friend of mine, Joanne Fish. She did a documentary, Handy's Blues. So I interviewed anybody I could, but I was looking specifically for people who had experiences like mine, coming from where I come from, and in the ethnic and cultural tradition I come from. And
Mhm.
that's kind of how. But I didn't know I was doing folklore. I didn't know I was engaging in ethnographic field interviews. Right. It just so
Uh-huh.
happens. Um, I was sitting at my workstation in the Bronx, and my wife walks over to me and she goes, you know that old white guy that goes to the South and he likes recording old black guys playing the blues. I was like, you talking about Lomax? And she said, yeah, that's what you do. So that's kind of how I figured out. So I started looking up what is Lomax, what is he, and that's how I found out what it was
Uh-huh.
that I was engaged in, and it kind of took that spark and lit it even further.
Mm-hmm. So what was it about music specifically that why did you want to find that?
Because that's the root of American and Black American existence.
Mm.
It is the first. I don't want to say the first, but of the major freed music, it had many names. Reels at one time,
Mm.
but as one musician told me, it's the butt naked truth.
That's a good quote.
Yeah. So, but the blues, it I don't know. It just made sense because that's the root.
Mhm.
If you go back a little further, you have slave seculars, you have prison work songs and spirituals, but all these things line up, and field hollers and these things line up into the blues, and
Mm.
the blues really becomes, as we know it, as documented, a vessel of authentic African American, Black American, indigenous, copper colored American
Mm.
narrative, if you will.
Mhm. So did your family, were they a storytelling family growing up?
See, this is what I'm saying. All these words had no merit, but the actions and behaviors. Yeah, my grandfather was a storyteller. My uncle,
Mm.
blessed today, my uncle's still a
Mhm.
storyteller. He would
Mhm.
call, or I would call him now, and he would have, and he's a jokester like my grandfather, right? So
Mhm.
and these are just two. my other uncle, all these folk on both sides of my family, there were storytellers. You know, there were holders of the scroll. There were, like my mother being a teacher and understanding certain things in our community and being active during the civil rights era. She understood documentation, and the pen was the most effective and significant weapon, as well as connection to your roots. So these things were instilled in me since I was a little guy. I just didn't understand what the hell, you know, so, but as my journey matured, and then I started understanding what folklore is, and the methods and things of this, and even ethnomusicology, I was able to pull from these childhood, teenage, and young adult experiences and memories to kind of harness my work, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite story from when you were growing up, or maybe that you heard later on when you were collecting stories? Is
A
there?
favorite story?
Yeah.
Man, there's so many. I mean, so there's a couple that my mother shared that I still talk with my wife and kids about. Um, the most recent, because we watched The Blackening the other day, and I remember my mother telling me why she doesn't fool with Ouija boards and stuff like this, because when she was in school in Tennessee, some of her friends was into that, and she went to they went in the attic and she saw stuff moving, and she ran out of there and never uh dealt with it again. And then they had a lot of, between her, my father, and uncles and aunts, they had a lot of Mississippi, Tennessee, and Louisiana stories. I know my mother, being my complexion, was there was a church that they used to go in the woods in Tennessee, when they were going to schools there. Her, my father, and their friends, and somehow my father, they weren't married at the time. He was my father. They were dating, and somehow he left her there. So when it was all over, she was stuck in the woods, and she's walking, trying to get, I guess, to the main road. And she said a truck came by, and they said to her, and this is in like 68,
Yeah.
1968, and she was like, the trucker came by. It was a group, about 4 or 5 of them, and they said, "Listen, darky, if we catch you here at nightfall, it's going to be a problem for you." So there was a lot of these stories, and there was fun stories as well. Like the a Ouija board, or the story in Brooklyn when they were kids. My mother and my uncle, and just one of the guys in their neighborhood and his friends were trying to rough up my uncle, and my mother jumped on him and bit a chunk of his hair out and socked him. "You're not gonna mess with my brother."
Don't mess with your mama.
Yeah, but w- however, narrative is important, and I'm not really doing these stories justice. But the way they all shared these stories throughout the years was very nuanced and even formative to a degree, right? But you got the motifs, you got the lessons, and then you also understood how they felt in these moments, whether it was good, bad, or indifferent.
Yeah. So it really raised you into the folklorist that you are now.
Yes, again by default, because I hadn't. That word was, folklore wasn't a big word, and proverb was a word, culture, tradition, right? Folklore wasn't a folks, because kinfolk was a big word, and but folklore wasn't really a big word in at that time.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about your New York Hall of Fame? How you got into it, and you were a musician. So tell us the journey into the New York Hall of Fames.
I like any other kid in that era, at some point became a rapper. But that experience, I mean, we used to go to Louisiana a lot, and even when me and my brother had our rap group, and we would go down to Mardi Gras, but there was just something always there. And what ends up happening is this: when I went there, we went there to bury my dad.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't just come back with questions.
Mm-hmm.
I came back and I bought a banjo and a guitar, and I started listening to just black spirituals, and
Mm-hmm.
then blues, and then I just got the ancestors visited me and said, "This is what you have to do." So I
Mm-hmm.
began learning and teaching and figuring out how to play my experience and keep it as authentic to our forefathers as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And had performances and became part of different organizations that I was able to rekindle, if you will, uh, blues to African American community, because it wasn't really in our community. Folks listened to it, older folks on their leisure, but it was usually in non-black spaces, you know.
Interesting.
And well, yeah, the festivals, the shows, it was really in non-black spaces,
Mm-hmm.
particularly acoustic, right? Because from the '60s, when the revival happened, it kind of gets lumped into folk
Mm-hmm.
and singer songwriter and
Mm-hmm.
bistro type college campus things. So you have generations of non-black spaces that celebrate uh, acoustic traditional music,
Mm-hmm.
and that kind of was birthed during the revival period.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there's some spaces, but what I was able to do, there's a organization, the New Amsterdam Musical Association, which was called NAMA Harlem. It was the very first. Uh, it was the first colored musicians union established in the late 1800s. You could not work as a musician if you was not in the union and if you couldn't read music. And they were not letting black and people of color into these unions. So they established New Amsterdam Musical Association. And I mean, Jelly Roll Martin, Scott Joplin, so many people went through this place in those days. There's a gentleman, I can't think of his name, and I feel horrible because he was a staple of a significant contribution to Black history and Black music.
Mm-hmm.
He was in the military. I think he was a Red Tail, and he was a humongous musician. He got killed out there in Harlem as well. But these men made this, and over 100 years later, after they bought that brownstone in Harlem, it's still there, and it became a nonprofit. And
Mm-hmm.
every once a month, I begin a program called Nama Blues and Poetry, which was
Mm-hmm.
a very organic space where we had performances, but it wasn't one way where the performer would sit on stage and just perform at the audience. We engaged in cultural and traditional and historical conversation
Mm-hmm.
about our music and traditional expression, um, collectively. So if you're in the audience after a song is played, you could just say, "Hey, so such and such and such," and then we get into like an hour conversation. And then we get back to playing, and it was a great space.
Uh-huh.
And that kind of got and I was also on the radio and doing podcasts, so that got the attention of the Blues Hall of Fame folk.
Mm.
And then they, Piedmont Blues, who they're tremendous, good friends of mine, Ben and Valerie Turner, and so we performed at BB King's, traditional blues. It was just amazing. I think after sound check is when it hit me. I'm in BB King's playing blues, like, pre-war country blues. Yeah.
Now, the music that you perform, is it all written by you, or is it a combination of older songs that you were just singing, or are you mixing them together? How is your music?
Excuse me. So it's still a definitely a learning curve. Majority of the pieces that I perform are my pieces.
Mm-hmm.
One reason is because not being able to figure out what they were playing. So you're trying to play what a Sun House or Muddy Waters is playing, and you can only get one or two things, and then I just go into it. You just hear something and you go somewhere else, which is kind of the way it should be. There's a couple of songs that I do incorporate that were done by Muddy Waters and Sun House, and there's some songs I'm working on now, actually, which is a good time to bring up the apprenticeship that I'm working with. I'm Corey Harris, and so he's going to coach me, teach me how to play. So we're trying to get 20 songs down from older musicians. Of course, the purpose is preservation, right? But what I would say outside of that, and by the way, that apprenticeship comes from Virginia Folklife and Virginia Humanities, and we were lucky to be able to cross borders with that. I would say I perform my own songs and tell my own story as it relates to the blues, and my family as it relates to the blues. But you can hear resemblance, if you will, to the sound of old, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Do you have your banjo or guitar? Do you want to play us a song?
So the banjo.
You're just learning.
The banjo, I received the Arnold Schultz scholarship from the International Bluegrass Music Association. So I'm working with Jordan Rain, a renowned banjo player right now, to learn that. That's not my forte.
Okay.
But this I could play a little bit, which is
that's beautiful.
Thank you. I'm in a kind of a bad position, so it may be a little difficult. I'll give you a little sample if I can.
Okay.
Because this is not the most comfortable. Like this is. All right. Late on in the evening, child, I feel like blowing my horn. I woke up this morning, find my little baby gone. Late on in the evening, man, I feel like blowing my horn. Well, woke up this morning, baby, find my little baby gone. Well, now, some folks say they worry, or blues ain't bad. That's misery feeling, child, I move most of her had. Some folk tell me, man, today, worry, or blues ain't bad. Well, Miss me your feeling, baby. Oh, I'm all ever. So that's like Muddy Waters,
Yeah.
country blues. You know,
That's beautiful.
thank you. And I have my own song. Oh, God, the moon, my spirit bad, Lord, bad. Oh, God, the moon, my spirit bad. I got a feeling it's with crack. Oh, Lord. So that's an original song there.
Okay. Wow, you have a perfect voice for singing that music because it's so deep and resonating. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Now, do you find that you're getting more people, younger people, who are interested? Because originally you said that it was primarily the older generations that listen to blues music. Are you finding more young people coming and listening?
Yeah. It's and it's not just me. It's a whole bunch of us because you have a John Tavius Willis, a Kingfish, a Mac McDonald. You have these young fellas, Marquise Knox. You have and I'm not mentioning all of them, and even the our young ladies that are like taking this by storm, and they're attracting people their age and younger, right? I know for me, as a folklorist slash musician, I've performed in churches and things like this where folks, older folks are like, my dad used to listen to this, or they remember, and they get excited, you know. Um but there are I was able to I know a couple of people from I guess 17 to my age, which is a huge, it's like a 30-year difference. But they'll reach out to me from time to time and say, hey, can I have a blues startup kit? Who should I listen to? How do I get to understand this? So it's it varies. It's not just me. I don't want to take credit for something that I'm just playing my part. I know one person I grew up with that's my age, and we're from the hip hop generation, like the legit hip hop generation. And he was like, "Yo, man, I never thought I'd be listening to blues or even talking about it." So it is catching on, but it's catching on for the reason I wanted to catch on, not just as a performative situation, but to understand the roots of our tradition, our culture, where our people come from, and how the music is a reflection of the expression is the reflection of the people and what the people were going through. Is there anything now that we're utilizing that came from there? So the blues narrative is a project that I've been working on, and it started doing during the quarantine. um and what it was looking to do is track and document the children of the Great Migration, the grandchildren of the Great Migration, how we're utilizing strategies, how we're implementing things in our households now that our parents, our grandparents, and great grandparents passed down to us. Is there anything? And it turns out there's a lot.
Mm.
right? That came down. Even Denise, my wife and I talk about this all the time because her people are from South Carolina, and when we get to the Gullah area of South Carolina, so when we get to talking about certain, even just remedies, medicine remedies, right?
Uh-huh.
And we get to laughing because what my grandmothers and her grandmothers would do for remedies are extremely similar,
Yeah.
and we didn't like it then. But the difference between then and now, we didn't have a choice in the matter. Where
Yeah.
the kids today think they have a choice, but you could, but you can see the connection and how things are passed
Mm.
down, and how we were able to I don't want to say sustain during that moment, and how friends and other relatives and some of the people I was able to interview were able to sustain based on these lessons, if you will, that was passed down for generations.
Hmm. You mentioned the Great Migration a couple times, but I'm not familiar with that term. Can you give us a little bit of a background or history lesson on that?
Sure. So the Great Migration is the movement of what is considered black folk from
Hmm.
the South to the Northeast, the Midwest, and the Northwest and Southwest.
Hmm.
Right? It happens in stages. A couple of times. It happened in the 1800s. Then it happened again, starting roughly between 1910 and 1914. Then, so the ones that are really documented are these three that I'm gonna mention now, starting roughly between 1910 and 1914, and then late 30s, early 40s, and then what's considered the last migration is the 1970.
Hmm.
We're seeing a reverse migration of the last 10 years, where a lot of these black folk that, like myself, our lineage starts in the South,
Hmm.
and then we traveled these places, are coming back to the South, reclaiming
Hmm.
what was once our land and things of that nature. So
Hmm.
that's the Great Migration.
Okay. Can you, so going back to blues music, you mentioned black spirituals. Can you give us a definition about what the difference between black spirituals and blues music is?
Absolutely. Blues music, first and foremost, let me tell you what it is not.
Okay.
Okay? Because so many people, including the people that come from this, misconstrue blues music is not slave music. Blues music actually was always a free music. Blues music, the term comes from multiple places. One of the initial terms it derives from means risque, right? So the red light district of New Orleans, I think it was man, I can't think of the not Stovall. I can't think of the name of the area, but it kind of comes out of this area of like a red light district of
Okay.
parlors and prostitution, and we have people like Jelly Roll Martin and Lead Belly playing in this area. Um, it also derives from when you move from working collectively in the field to working by yourself on a plow, and then you add in an instrument. The blues is not just downtrodden. It is also party music. It
Mm.
pop music of its time, but it's more secular, right? Secular in the fact that it's the if you're familiar with scripture, there's a natural man and there's a spiritual man. So the
Mhm.
blues would be the natural man, and the black spirituals will be the spiritual man,
Mm.
right?
Okay.
Now, there's different tiers of black spiritual, because now you have upscale church, AME churches and things like this. AMEs don't get upset with me, but there's upper echelon, where the black spirituals were sang in a way that did not reflect the backwood black folk, with the intention of galvanizing white funding, like the Fifth Jubilee Singers, you know. But then you also have the backwood spirituals, which is hoot and hollering, right? Which and it's not so Europeanly polished. And I say Europeanly polished because musicologists of the early years of the turn of the century degraded black music because they couldn't understand it. The music is technical, and black folk understood it. That's why they did it well, right? So there's a European style of hymns, and then there's a Black American style of hymns. You know, so that's kind of the nut and bolts, if you will.
And you said that blues music is a free man's music. So slaves did not have their own form of blues music?
So there's something called slave seculars.
Okay.
Right? And there was more free blacks than slaves, but slaves had secular music. It was called slave secular. They also played reels. They also played what's called songster style music and string music. Right? Blues, you see multiple times. However, it makes it's real surgent after the emancipation, if you will, if that's even a thing. But as it's documented, where now you have different versions of the story. Some of these stories were sang way back when, but then some of these stories were sang differently. Some of them were sang on plantations, right? But blues, in some people's eyes, Black and Latino blues musicians, if you will, the blues single-handedly disrupted minstrelsy.
Disrupted what?
Minstrelsy.
Okay, what is that?
Minstrel shows.
I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, I'm sorry. So you have vaudeville and minstrel, and minstrel are the the Jim Crow blackface shows, you know, and because the blues is not just one person on an instrument, because you also have what is called classic blues, which is where the big bands come from, and women leading these big bands and singing. But when you hear what they're singing about, these are songs of self-empowerment, however you flip it, right? Whether you agree, because some of them are very raunchy, you know, and then a term that also was called coon shouting, right? And most women did that. And there's white women who were coon shouting too. And some of them were rather good. What ends up happening is a propaganda piece that sheds a dirty light. And so a prestigious Black composer was like, we got to stop using these terms, because the people that are degrading us are the people that are making money off this, and we're not even making the money off it. So they stopped using those kind of terms. But there's just a lot to process and unpack, because there's a time where great musicians can only get paid in vaudeville and minstrel shows. These were big productions, right? These were big to-do productions, you know. So there's just a lot to unpack there. But blues kind of comes in, and it shows the empowerment of Black market, right? black music market. Also, the genius of musicians who understand, when I go into this region, I have to give myself a colloquialism or a coin name that reflects this area, and then I have to go to this area, and so Ragtime Johnny in Kentucky is going to be Mississippi Johnny in the Delta, because he understands that how he has to make a profit. And I think these things go unnoticed, but should be, because the story usually is these are illiterate hobo men that can't read or can't do nothing and just sitting on somebody's porch. That's not, these were men and women that were professionals, you know, and you know,
adjusting for their audience.
Hmm?
They were adjusting for their
ma'am.
audiences.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. They understood what they had to do to get booked.
So, what is coon shouting? That sounds so interesting. What did that sound like? Did it sound like they were actually shouting?
Well, no, shouting is like field holler. It's a style of singing.
Oh, okay.
That I mean, we still hear it today. It is not the polished song. It is when you hear vocal phrasing that is synonymous with black singing.
So, do you know when the first is there a first documented blues song, or where it started? You said Louisiana was where you felt it was originated from.
I said some people say that's where it started, but the first, I would say, one of the initial recordings, because you have a couple of people recording in the early 20s.
Okay.
You know, and this brings us to the blues festival that we just put on out here.
Oh yes, tell us about that.
It's called the Black Bottoms Acoustic Blues and Field Hollers Festival, honoring Sylvester Weaver, because Sylvester Weaver records the first couple of songs 100 years ago that solidifies country blues as we know it today.
Wow.
Yes.
That's so awesome.
Yes. And then there's also, go ahead, I'm sorry.
How long has that festival been going on? Is this a new festival?
This was our first year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Because it was it was imperative to get it done this year.
Yeah.
Because it's a significant mark.
And how did it go? What was the turnout? Did you have a lot of musicians show up?
Yeah, so our featured musician was Alvin Youngblood Hart, who is a phenomenal musician all around, but he definitely knows how to blues. Okay. We had local musicians. We had the Go Lighties, who is a family out here, I think in Madisonville, that sings black spirituals. They opened up. However, it was a 2-day festival. So the first day we had narrative stages, and in those stages we discussed. I wouldn't say we discussed, but we did local organizations and folk that was doing significant work were able to present to the audience these works. The Jonesville Project, which is very significant out here because it was a black community of black folk who owned their homes, and the city and state condemned it, and they were part of urban renewal, and now the university sits on where these people's homes were. Then we had the black music narrative stage where Brett Bjorkman spoke about their music project which honors and celebrates local Kentucky musicians, and also in this region.
Mhm.
Erica Brady spoke on John Edmonds, who was a local gospel and blues hero who passed. Our dean, Terrence Brown, who was a African-American opera singer, and he
Wow.
spoke and he sang and tore the house down. And Alvin Youngblood Hart presented, and then we had a presentation about Sylvester Weaver from Michael Jones, who is a Kentucky historian, and we had Big Papa and Miss M. They performed Sylvester Weaver and Sarah Martin songs. And Sarah Martin did some cuts with Sylvester Weaver in the early days. And then the following day, we had a music workshop. I guess introducing the basic fundamental of
Mm.
blues guitar, and then the musicians came out and got busy.
Mhm. So, blues music, you mentioned the opera singer. Blues music is, more than just one specific genre. Is that right? It feeds into a lot of different genres. Can you talk a little bit about that?
You'll find blues in everything. Blues is the roots, right? You find blues in rhythm and blues. You find blues in Americana. You find blues in bluegrass. You find blues in rap. You find blues in the British invasion, which is humorous, a slap in the face, and amazing all at the same time, because it is just black music repackaged and sold to America, because they would not I would say they would not, a portion would not receive it from American blacks, right? But
Mm-hmm.
over there, they loved it. You know, they, as in everyone overseas, looked at the men and women here that were looked at as dirt. Overseas, they revered them as kings and queens. And you can hear in the music of the old days, Josephine Baker, all of them, how they were revered overseas. Even Charlie Patton said, "I'm going," and Robert Johnson, "I'm going to Paris, or I'm going to Ethiopia, somewhere outside of here." Anyway, blues is in pretty much every genre of music you can think of.
Mm-hmm.
Opera, I wouldn't say it's the blues, but similar to black traditional music and its tradition. It highlights our first and most important instrument, which is our voice.
Mm.
And someone like Dean Terrence Brown, I mean, he has a very powerful voice, and he just brought the house down.
So the banjo is the instrument I always think of when I think of blues music, and you said that's an instrument that you were
The
currently trying
banjo,
to learn. Yeah, the banjo. Is it very different from the guitar or other stringed instruments?
it is, because the band, and so the banjo, and I'm not by no means a banjo historian, so I can give you what little I know. There's banjo historians out here, some of them I know,
Wow.
right? But what I could tell you is the sound is very bright. You could make it sound a little dark, but it's not the same feeling
Mm.
as a guitar. We also
Mhm.
have to like foodways. Instruments play a part in societal shifts, right? So at one time, having a banjo, having a guitar, having a piano, having sheet music was for the upper echelons. So you were not considered cultured if you didn't have these things in your home. But
Mhm.
but at the same token, it also came to a point, particularly because of Jim Crow minstrels. It wasn't a good look for a black person to be seen with a banjo. because of propaganda shows and things of this nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have to remember how society plays a part in what a lot of these instruments represent in different eras, if that makes any
Mm-hmm.
sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You mentioned, well,
And that's also
you,
for string music. I mean to cut you off. I'm speaking more about the black story because that's my lane. But
mhm,
but in the Appalachia and in the string music of that region, they were treated the same way when it came to banjos. Hillbilly music
right,
is not a compliment, right? That's a disparaging term. So it's not just in the black community this was happening.
right.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, well, to that point, there is a connection between blues music and hillbilly music. Um, where is that connection? Where did that start from, or do you know?
Arnold Schultz, um, Bill Monroe. Arnold Schultz taught all these guys out here. Leslie Riddle taught, and these are two black men.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the so in the Appalachia, if I'm saying it right, and again,
Mm-hmm.
that's something I'm not an expert on either. But what I
Mm-hmm.
do know is there's more black people, and there were more black people there than talked about or given credit to for several reasons, right? And there's poor white people there.
Mm-hmm.
And they were exploited by people in our field. So I'm very
Mm-hmm.
careful how I describe this.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that is for sure, whether people like each other or not, being poor makes you have to interact and rely on each other.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have a situation where you have someone like Arnold Schultz or Leslie Riddle, who are great musicians, and they're teaching both kind of communities how to do these, how to play this,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in one way or another. It may not be as we call a formal lesson, could be just playing together.
Mm-hmm.
And we with the Southern Black tradition or African tradition or Scottish Irish or American white, all these people, you know, you have variations of things that become a particular style of music, and that's the
Mm-hmm.
best way I could kind of express that, because some of
Mm-hmm.
these things I'm not an expert in. I just have a little bit of knowledge because it, as you know, everything kind of connects.
Yeah. The question I was going to ask before is there any connection with Juneteenth and blues music?
Uh, Ironic that you asked me that. Now This reached out to me about that, and I was featured in a Now This segment
Oh, wow.
because I wrote an article or essay on my website, Jack Dapper Blues, that you can't mention Juneteenth without mentioning the blues.
Okay.
And it does. We do also have to recognize that Juneteenth is really specifically for Texas and a
Mm-hmm.
particular part of Texas. But there are many emancipation celebrations throughout the Black South. There's August 8th that's specific to Tennessee and Kentucky and Paducah and this border here,
Okay.
right? Um, and there was a emancipation, if I'm not mistaken, as early as 1801. I don't know. It's in the article.
Mm-hmm.
It was a long
Right.
time ago. But what I can say is these things are connected. You have someone like Elijah Cox, who is a songster and a musician. He was a Buffalo Soldier. Um, he was featured in Born into Slavery, the slave narrative, right?
Mm-hmm.
People thought he was a slave, but he was never a slave. He was born free. And he stayed in the area that he served in. And when he was serving, he served with former slaves. So he learned songs of 100, 200 years old, and he carried that
Mm.
into the new century.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to mention one with the other, because they kind of, blues as we begin to know it kind of surfaces or uh, uh, develops, if you will, at this time
Mm-hmm.
of emancipation.
Right, exactly. So I was just looking at our time. I wanted to make sure that we talk about your the bluegrass music, the International Bluegrass Music Association. Have you mentioned that one already?
Yes, that's the Arnold Schultz scholarship I got to learn the banjo and add it to my
Okay.
repertoire. And Arnold Schultz is the father of, if you will, African American man who taught who's considered the father of bluegrass how to play.
And so you have the African-American Folklorist is an offshoot of Jack Dapper blues. Can you talk a little bit about how what you are trying to really focus on in this podcast and magazine?
Absolutely. The African American Folklorist is distributed by my organization, Jack Dapper Blues Heritage Preservation Foundation. The goal is to highlight, first and foremost, is to bridge the gap between laypersons and academia. It is to give a space for community, independent, and academic scholars to partake or participate, if you will, in the documentation and raise the awareness of Black folk life, right? Foodways, religion, everything. We can go to the gambit. Because folklore, folk life, ethnography, if you will, and the methods utilized. Like I said, Shirley Moody Turner was the first Black folklorist I came across. She's a great scholar, but it took me a long time to find her. So I want to highlight folk of color, Black folk that is doing the work, but I also, in highlighting the people doing the work, I want to make sure that the stories and experiences and the oral histories have a place to live. So everybody, it doesn't matter, excuse me, if you're African American, if you're American African American, if you're Black Hebrew, if you're Christian Muslim, whatever it is, your folk narrative, if you will, belongs at the African American Folklorist, where people can come and read it, engage, and participate in it.
So let's talk about a little bit about what you talk about on the podcast and the magazine. Foodways, you mentioned that several times. Can you talk a little bit about the different foodways?
Yeah, so I think foodways might be one of the most easiest ones. It may not be, and it also could be because I'm currently TAing a foodways course. So,
well, but everybody loves food, right? So I think it is an easy gateway.
Right. So foodways, when it comes to African American or Black traditions, it's not much different from other people. But I'll speak in regards to this. It's celebratory. It's also a way of coming of age. So when the niece or the daughter becomes a certain age, they can go in the kitchen with grandmama and auntie and become part of the quote unquote adult woman conversation. And as small as people may think that is, that's not just foodways, right? But that's ritual. That's there's so many different titles and things that go along with this experience that's happening over the creation of a dish. And this is what we celebrate.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
Do
these
you
are the type
have
of things.
Do you have a favorite food from your family culture?
Great question. I have a favorite food from my family culture, but I also have a favorite food from my community culture.
Mm.
Right? So for my family, if it's barbecue ribs, mac and cheese, or collard greens and
Hmm.
smoked neck bones, which at this point, out of all the people in my family that made it, my wife makes the best collards and smoked neck bones. Yes, she does. um, however, community wise, I grew up in Brooklyn, and I'm accustomed to eating curry goat from either the Trinidadian or Jamaican spot.
Oh, uh-huh.
So that's a neighborhood, that's a communal food way, right? Which I cannot find out here. I'm going crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. I wouldn't imagine it would be very prevalent. Talk to me about mac and cheese. Is it you're not making like the Kraft mac and cheese? How are you making mac and cheese specific to your family or your community?
Well, I'm not making it, I'm eating it. But I could tell you, from my great grandma to my grandma to my mama and aunties and my wife, and soon my daughters, they they have, and it's just really beautiful how each generation takes from the last and adds something specific of their own to
Mm-hmm.
even enrich it that much more, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's a way that it has to be done, and you have to, and even the things that I cook, right? It has to be done. It sounds really cliche, but you have to be in a loving mood. You know, I get
Mm.
you get the music going, because if you're in a bad mood, or if you have a angry spirit, the food is
Mm.
going to come out that way.
Mm. Mm. That's such a good way of putting it. Yeah, I agree. You, you really need to have the right spirit to make
Yes,
good
ma'am.
food, right? What about vernaculars? That was listed in something that you discuss in the African American experience. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it's different across the country?
Well, you know what? I'll give you a specific example. I do not remember the word. What I do remember is Robert Kimbrough Sr. He's a blues musician.
Mm-hmm.
He's Junior Kimbrough's son, so he's also a legacy out of Mississippi, North Hill Country. He and I was on one of my radio shows, and a friend of mine that grew up with me, we went to high school together, and he lived 5 blocks away from me, called in. He runs a football team for the youth. So the
Mm-hmm.
three of us are having a live conversation on the air, and a word comes up that me and my buddy I grew up with, we identify the word in the same way. But Robert Kimbrough is like, that's not what it means here. And he's like, what? Man, I thought it meant the same thing in all black communities, but it doesn't,
Uh-huh.
right? Vernaculars shift in regions, and it also shifts in folk groups sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that's something that once I was aware of, we want to highlight that as well, because no one is no, I should say no one, no folk group, ethnicity, tribe, or nationality is monolithic, right?
Right. Exactly. What about one of the things that you mentioned was traditional engagement.
Traditional engagement, yes.
What does that look like?
Oh, wow. So traditional engagement, again, like the ritual of coming of age, traditional engagement could be almost anything. It could be repeating your first date
Mm.
as a celebration of being with your significant other. Um, one a joke I make that encapsulates foodways and celebratory events. One thing I noticed: it doesn't matter if it's a funeral, a marriage, a birthday, whatever the ceremony is, the food selection in this traditional engagement in the Black community is the same. It is
Mm.
fried chicken. It is mac and cheese. It is, so we have these engagements that a lot of things, it could be for anything, a birthday, but the
Mhm.
food might be the same. So these are the different things that we look to. I guess I don't want to say interrogate, but share. You know,
Mhm.
but that's what it's pretty much a traditional engagement is something an engagement done traditionally.
Have you seen any traditions that um, are unique?
In what way?
Well, maybe something that you didn't know about growing up, or that you came across that you found interesting, or maybe something that your family does or your community does that isn't done elsewhere. Is there something um, that is special?
Well, I'll say less than unique. Something I didn't know.
Okay.
I grew up in a Black church, but it was Pentecostal.
Okay.
Prior to that, my family, I believe, went to a Methodist church, if I'm not mistaken. But based on my personal experience and what I thought I knew, notice I say what I thought
Hmm.
I knew. I just figured I knew everything about the Black church experience. And then I get to the Bible Belt, and this is recent, and I
Hmm.
meet predominant, respectable women that are reverends in the Baptist church. These Black women,
Hmm.
and this goes for white women too. This is just for women, period. I had no clue that women were not to have any uh, position of authority in the Baptist church. That
Mm.
simply blew me away that at this day and age, we're still having firsts to that level.
Yes,
You know,
absolutely.
right? So that's something that was new to me.
Hmm.
And it taught me a lot, and it also uh, reminded me as a folklorist, particularly an applied folklorist, we never go into anything thinking we have all the answers. It's more or less seeking answers, and then how can I facilitate what you want from what we find?
Hmm. Yeah. One of the things that you listed on your website is that you try and tackle sensitive Black topics. Can
Yeah.
you talk a little bit about how you do that, and with what you're trying to achieve with that?
Um. Excuse me. Well, I guess to achieve is if it's not addressed, it's like real. I guess the best way to put it, if you have an ailment that's not addressed, and you one day you're walking down the street, you're just going to kneel over.
Mm-hmm.
Had you addressed it, you may have had a longer life,
Mm-hmm.
right? I'm not a green or naive to think that everyone will be kumbaya. However, I'm a firm believer if there is understanding, we can coexist. If
Mm-hmm.
you understand my culture and I understand yours, then our communication is different.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll understand or have an understanding of what you're attempting to communicate. A lot of times, conflict comes from miscommunication.
Mm-hmm.
Miscommunication comes from a vernacular of different cultures, and sometimes within the same culture, right?
Right.
So my goal is to tackle in some cases things that are not discussed so that we can get an understanding. And then we
Mm-hmm.
get these understandings for Black, white, and everyone in between. Because initially
Mm-hmm.
I was just gun ho, and you're trying to prove me wrong. I'm going to prove you wrong, but that doesn't help. And
Mm-hmm.
let's place this information so people can get an understanding of,
Mm-hmm.
of what this is about.
Right.
If that
If you
makes any
ask the
sense.
right questions, maybe people will start to understand where the misconceptions are coming from.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So, and this is going to be probably the last question. What do you want to really achieve? What do you want to see from all of this work? Maybe 10, 15 years down the road, what would you like this work to have paved the way for?
A couple of things off top. One, my goal has always been to put the Black American story and narrative in the proper context.
Mm-hmm.
It's always been hard for me to receive the fact that a non-Black person goes into a Black community that some Black people don't even want to go into because of safety reasons or whatever, and you're getting information. It's just hard for me to believe that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it's
Right.
not even just from a Black perspective. That's for anybody, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but in interrogating the early works, I'm thankful for it. It gives us a starting place.
Mm-hmm.
But to answer your question on the one note, it's to put our narrative in the proper context. This is
Mm-hmm.
what it really is about, and it's coming from the people. It's not interpretive. This is someone of the folk group. These are people of the folk group telling you, right? And that leads to part two. If nothing else, I want to advocate for every folk group to have someone from their particular folk group preserve and document their folk group and folk narrative. I don't care who you are. If you're of the Confederate line, have somebody in your family document your story. If you're in I don't know, whatever. I can't think of anything, but I wanted to try to say something so polar opposite to what I represent, so you can see the gravity of the importance of having someone from your folk group document and preserve the narrative, because then you get it not interpretive.
Mm-hmm.
And then from that point, we can begin the discussion, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's some work, I think I read a quote from you that said that you are trying to disseminate information in a collaborative effort. Taking storytelling, entrepreneurship, and bringing them together to disseminate information in a collaborative effort.
Yes, ma'am.
Are you, so from that, when I was reading that, it seemed to me that you were working towards, I don't know, building, I don't really know, building like businesses, or I'm not specifically you, but helping the community in that way. I'm not really sure.
Yes.
I don't know.
Yes. Absolutely. I'm not an expert in tourism, right? I think I'm working to be a master in my craft when it comes to not just documentation and preservation, but education, right?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So all
Yeah.
these things kind of go hand in hand. So
Mm-hmm.
you know, you want, well, I would like to help advocate and help make sustainable revenue for communities who want to have programming, whether it's funded by state government, federal, or they have to charge.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because public programming is part of folklore.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on what the administration is and who runs the administration, public programming usually is the first to be hatched. And it is definitely unfortunate, but a fact, that Black American organizations usually get the least resources in these situations.
Okay.
You know,
And you want to change that?
100%.
Right. Well, it seems like you were well on your way to the education and advocacy, and I wish you luck in your endeavors, because it sounds like such amazing projects that you're working on.
I appreciate that. I pray for peace and sleep.
And sleep. And thank you, folksy folks, for joining us on this blues and African-American journey today. What did you learn about blues and about the folklore of African-Americans? Please share your thoughts on our Facebook community group. We have a place where we really trying to encourage our audience members to continue the conversation after we've finished with our podcast, because this is not just a podcast at you. We want this to be a community conversation where we are having discussions with one another to make those connections that I talked about in the intro. Where you can connect with us on Facebook, on Twitter, or X as it's now called, Instagram. We're on YouTube as well. I don't know if you're listening on a podcast platform. Please consider rating us and giving us a review. That is so incredibly helpful for a new podcast like us. And make sure you're subscribing. Thank you once again for listening to Fabric of Folklore. My name is Vanessa Y. Rogers, and until next time, keep the folk alive.